Hideki Tojo, a general loyal to Hirohito who turned Asia into hell. Part 1. Origins of a Soldier. Born on December 30, 1884, in the Kojamachi district of Tokyo, Hideki Tojo entered the world during a pivotal time in Japan's national transformation. The country was still in the throes of the Meiji Restoration, an era in which feudal traditions gave way to rapid modernization and militarization. Tojo's early life was firmly rooted in the legacy of the samurai. His father, Hidenori Tojo, was a former samurai who had adapted to the new order as a lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. His mother came from a religious lineage, being the daughter of a Buddhist priest. Though socially respectable, the Tojo household lived in modest financial conditions, embodying the lower strata of Japan's military aristocracy. From a young age, Tojo showed traits that would come to define his adult life: stubbornness, inflexibility, and relentless discipline. Described as serious and humorless, he harbored an intense sense of duty. In school, he was not particularly noted for brilliance, but his unwavering commitment to hard work earned him steady academic progress. The Meiji educational system, shaped by nationalist values and rigid discipline, deeply influenced Tojo. It was an era when academic failure was met with disdain rather than support, and children were trained not merely to pass exams, but to uphold national honor. In this context, Tojo's personality and worldview began to crystallize. His boyhood idol was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate and an emblem of stoic endurance. One of Ieyasu's maxims, "Avoid the things you like, turn your attention to unpleasant duties," resonated deeply with the young Hideki. This philosophy became Tojo's personal creed. He often repeated the self-effacing claim that he was not particularly talented, but that his success stemmed from a capacity for unceasing effort. "I am just an ordinary man possessing no shining talents," he once said. "Anything I have achieved I owe to my capacity for hard work and never giving up." In 1899, at the age of 15, Tojo enrolled in the Japanese Army Cadet School, a crucial turning point in his life. There, military hierarchy, ritualized discipline, and nationalist fervor were drilled into cadets with unyielding precision. The curriculum not only emphasized physical endurance and tactical skills, but also ideological loyalty to the emperor and the Kokutai mystical notion of the national polity rooted in the divine origin of the imperial house. Tojo excelled in this system not through innate brilliance, but through sheer effort and a total suppression of personal desires. By the time he graduated, Japan was beginning to assert itself as a modern imperial power. The defeat of China in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1895, and the surprise victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905, gave Japan a new sense of destiny. These events, alongside the rise of Pan-Asian nationalism and the glorification of the military, profoundly shaped the worldview of young officers like Tojo. Tojo's reaction to the Treaty of Portsmouth, which concluded the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, revealed the depth of his nationalist convictions. Like many Japanese citizens, he was enraged by the treaty's terms, which he viewed as humiliating. The widespread belief in Japan was that the United States, particularly President Theodore Roosevelt, had denied Japan the full fruits of its hard-won military victory. This perceived injustice ignited a long-standing anti-American sentiment within Tojo, one that would simmer for decades until culminating in his role as architect of the war against the United States in 1941. That same year, 1905, also marked Tojo's formal entry into the Imperial Japanese Army as a second lieutenant. It was the beginning of a long and steady ascent through the ranks of Japan's military machine, which would eventually see him occupy the highest political and military offices in the nation. But in these early years, he remained a young, serious, officer-ambitious, ideologically driven, and utterly devoted to the emperor's cause. In 1909, Tojo married Katsuko Ito, a union that bore 3 sons and 4 daughters. Yet even within his family, Tojo's priorities remained fixed on his military duties. He delegated all domestic responsibilities to his wife, seeing child-rearing as a woman's work and a distraction from his public obligations. Tojo's personal life was thus consistent with his rigid worldview, one in which sacrifice, hierarchy, and absolute loyalty to the state defined the essence of a man's purpose. These formative years laid the foundation for the man who would later lead Japan into some of its darkest hours. They forged a character defined by discipline over compassion, ideology over flexibility, and ambition over reflection. Part 2. Shaping a Militarist Mind in a Changing World. By the time Hideki Tojo graduated from the Japanese Military Academy in March 1000, 905 ranking 10th out of a competitive class of 363 cadetshi was entering an army that had just emerged triumphant from one of the most significant military confrontations of the early 20th century. The Russo-Japanese War had not only stunned the world with Japan's unexpected victory over a major European power, but it had also profoundly reshaped Japan's view of its own place in the international order. For young officers like Tojo, it reinforced the belief that Japan had a divine and manifest destiny to lead Asia. Tojo's early military assignments involved routine garrison duties and participation in the slow process of turning Japan's conscript-based army into a more modern, industrialized war machine. But it was his deployment to Siberia in 1919 during Japan's intervention in the Russian Civil War that provided him his first taste of complex international operations. As a junior officer in the expeditionary force, Tojo observed firsthand how Japan, along with other Allied powers, sought to influence the post-revolutionary Russian chaos. This episode deepened his conviction in the necessity of Japanese strength on the continental stage and that Japan's geopolitical rivals, particularly the Soviet Union, must be held at bay through military preparedness. Tojo's ideological framework was further developed during his years as a military attaché in Germany from 1919 to 1922. These were years of political upheaval in the defeated Weimar Republic, where national humiliation, resentment, and militaristic nostalgia simmered in the post-Versailles climate. Though Germany was formally disarmed and politically unstable, its intellectual military traditions still held enormous sway over Japanese officers like Tojo, whose own army had been heavily shaped by the German model since the 19th century. He absorbed many of the ideas being discussed in conservative military circles, including the notion of a defense state, Verstata, totalitarian structure in which all aspects of national life were subordinated to military objectives. Tojo's exposure to Germany was not limited to its military theories. Upon his return to Japan in 1922, he traveled across the United States by train, a rare experience for a Japanese officer at the time. Yet this visit only deepened his suspicions and disdain for Western society. Tojo found Americans to be a people consumed by materialism, obsessed with personal pleasure, and weak in moral discipline. He came to see the United States as a civilization in decay, one that might be technologically strong but spiritually unfit for the kind of sacrifice required in prolonged conflict. These views, hardened early in his career, would later shape his fatal underestimation of American resolve in the Pacific War. Despite these growing ideological convictions, Tojo was not a demagogue. He rarely gave public speeches or wrote political tracts, but he cultivated a reputation as a hard-nosed, efficient officer deeply committed to hierarchy, order, and the sanctity of the military. He was considered humorless, stern, and intensely formal, more of a bureaucratic war planner than a battlefield hero. His only known hobby, he claimed, was paperwork. In fact, he often brought stacks of it home and worked late into the night, refusing to participate in the domestic or emotional life of his family. As his career progressed, Tojo rose to the rank of colonel by 1928 and became increasingly involved in the internal politics of the army. During his command of the 8th Infantry Regiment, he began to show a strong interest in the ideological training of his men. He frequently visited their homes, helped resolve their personal issues, and loaned money to junior officers in need. Yet his concept of leadership remained strictly paternalistic. Officers, he told his subordinates, should serve as both fathers and mothers to the troops, a reflection of Confucian ideals filtered through Japanese military culture. By the early 1930s, Japan had already taken significant steps toward military domination of the state. The economic crisis of the Great Depression, coupled with social unrest and a growing disdain for parliamentary politics, allowed ultranationalist elements in the military to assume a more central role in policymaking. Tojo found himself increasingly aligned with the control faction, Seiha, a group within the army that advocated for a total mobilization of the nation under a centralized command structure. Although they competed for dominance with the more radical Imperial Way faction, Kodoha, both groups shared an unwavering belief in expansionism, militarism, and the divinity of the emperor. Tojo also emerged as a vocal opponent of Western influence in Japanese society. He decried what he saw as the cultural decay brought by Western fashions and moral laxity. He mocked public displays of affection, such as hand-holding or kissing, and feared that the growing popularity of ero guro nonsensu, eroticism, grotesquerie, and nonsense, in art and literature was undermining the national spirit. For Tojo, Japan's strength lay not in mimicry of the West, but in returning to its native virtue hierarchy, discipline, and martial honor. His disdain for Western hypocrisy reached a peak in 1924 when the United States passed the Immigration Act, effectively banning Asian immigration. Tojo regarded the law as a blatant example of white supremacy and racial discrimination. "It shows how the strong will always put their own interests first," he wrote bitterly. Japan, too, has to be strong to survive in the world. This episode further reinforced his belief that coexistence with the West on equal terms was impossible, that Japan must chart its own path through strength, even if it meant war. By the early 1930s, Tojo was not yet a central political figure, but his ideological framework was complete. He had seen enough of the world to believe that diplomacy was often a smokescreen for power, that the West would never treat Japan as an equal, and that only through unwavering commitment to national strength could Japan achieve its rightful destiny. These beliefs, nourished over decades of service, would find their full and catastrophic expression in the years to come. Part 3. Climbing the military hierarchy and embracing total war. By the dawn of the 1930s, Hideki Tojo's career had reached a crucial phase. Though not yet a household name in Japan, he had become a respected officer known for his discipline, bureaucratic efficiency, and ideological purity. His rise coincided with a period of profound transformation in Japan, where the military was becoming the central force in political life. In this climate, Tojo's worldview aligned perfectly with the growing militarist consensus. Japan must become a total war, state economically, politically, and socially if it was to survive and thrive in a hostile international system. Tojo was promoted to Major General in 1934 and took charge of the Personnel Department of the Army Ministry. In this role, he wielded significant power over officer assignments, promotions, and internal discipline, a key position in shaping the Army's institutional culture. He used this authority to reward loyalty and hard work while promoting like-minded nationalists who shared his belief in the emperor's divine mission and the necessity of military dominance in government. He cultivated an atmosphere of ideological rigidity and intolerance for dissent. Tojo did not merely enforce policy, he sought to shape minds. That same year, the Army Ministry published a book titled Hijoji Kokumen Zenshu, Essays in Time of National Emergency, which was effectively a manifesto for a new form of totalitarianism. Tojo contributed one of the essays, arguing passionately for the establishment of a Kokusodoin Taisei, national defense state. In his view, Japan must emulate the wartime spirit that had led to its victory over Russia in 1905 and apply it to every aspect of modern society. Politics, economics, culture, nothing should be exempt from the requirements of war. He called for a system in which the government would control all aspects of civilian life. using centralized authority to mold the nation into a monolithic war machine. In Tojo's mind, this transformation was not a betrayal of Japanese tradition, but its fulfillment. He believed in the supremacy of Bushido, the samurai code of honor and loyalty, and considered Japan's spiritual strength its greatest asset. Western democracies, he believed, were morally weak and disunified, rotting from the inside due to liberalism, capitalism, and materialism. Tojo saw Japan's future not in becoming more like the West, but in purifying itself of its influence. In August 1934, Tojo assumed command of the IJA 24th Infantry Brigade. The following year, he was transferred to the Kwantung Army in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, a region that had become the testing ground for Japan's imperial ambitions and the military's appetite for unilateral expansion. There, he assumed command of the Kempeitai military police in September 1935. The Kwantung Army operated largely autonomously, and in many ways it represented the cutting edge of Japan's emerging colonial military rule. It was also a hotbed of political intrigue, ideological radicalism, and unrestrained violence. While stationed in Manchuria, Tojo earned the nickname Kamisarithe Razor for his sharp intellect, legalistic thinking, and ruthless decisiveness. As head of the Kempeitai, he oversaw not only military discipline but also intelligence, espionage, and political repression. Suspected communists, Chinese nationalists, and Korean dissidents were hunted down and interrogated. His work in Manchuria solidified his reputation as an unyielding enforcer of military authority and a staunch advocate for expansionism on the Asian mainland. Tojo's factional alignment with the Toseiha, control faction, within the army distinguished him from his more radical rivals in the Kodoha, Imperial Way faction. Though both groups believed in Japan's divine destiny and the need for war, they differed in method. The KD-ha believed in spiritual purity, spontaneous violence, and coup d'état to cleanse the system. The Seiha, by contrast, emphasized modernization, technocratic control, and working within existing structures to achieve authoritarian rule. Tojo belonged firmly to the latter group. He despised chaos and disdained romanticism. His vision of authoritarianism was meticulous and institutionalized. This ideological battle came to a head during the February 26 incident of 1936, when young KD-ha officers launched a failed coup in Tokyo. Tojo, loyal to the established chain of command, was instrumental in suppressing the rebellion. As a senior officer in Manchuria, he ordered the arrest of any Kwantung officers suspected of supporting the uprising. The failure of the coup marked the end of the KD-ha's influence, and in the aftermath, Tojo and the Seiha purged the army of many radical elements. This victory helped centralize military power and position Tojo as one of the dominant figures in the army's leadership. The next stage of Tojo's career placed him directly at the forefront of Japanese expansionism. In 1937, he was promoted to lieutenant general and became chief of staff of the Kwantung Army, one of the most powerful commands in the Japanese military. That same year, the Marco Polo Bridge incident triggered the full-scale invasion of China, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War. Although Tojo did not initiate the conflict, he became a key architect of its expansion. In this role, Tojo helped orchestrate military operations aimed at extending Japanese influence across northern China, including the strategic provinces of Inner Mongolia and Chahar. These campaigns were driven by both strategic calculation and ideological fervor. Japan sought to secure its continental base, sever Chinese nationalist resistance, and assert dominance over East Asia. Though often remembered as a cold and calculating bureaucrat, Tojo personally led troops during Operation Chahar, one of the early offensives of the war. This was his only significant battlefield experience, but it further cemented his credentials as both a commander and a strategist. His collaboration with ultranationalists like Yosuke Matsuoka and economic planners like Nobusuke Kishi helped align Japan's military aggression with its political and economic institutions. In effect, Tojo was helping to build not just a war machine, but an empire. In 1938, Tojo was recalled to Tokyo and appointed Vice Minister of the Army under Seishiro Itagaki. The Second Sino-Japanese War was entering its second year with no end in sight. Tojo threw himself into the task of managing the war effort from the capital, bringing his signature diligence, discipline, and authoritarian instincts to bear on military policy. A year later, in 1939, he was appointed Inspector General of Army Aviation, of the highest ranking and most influential posts in the military bureaucracy. By the eve of World War II, Hideki Tojo had become one of the most powerful men in Japan. He had ascended through the ranks, not through battlefield glory, but through relentless work ethic, ideological conformity, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. He had shaped the military into a tool not only of conquest, but of governance, culture, and state ideology. And yet, Tojo remained convinced that Japan's survival in the modern world required further expansion, deeper control, and a readiness to embrace total war. The stage was now set for his elevation to political leadership, a transition that would place him at the helm of the Japanese state during one of the most devastating wars in human history. Part 4. From Army Minister to Architect of War. By 1940, Hideki Tojo had become an indispensable figure in the machinery of the Japanese state. After decades of rising through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army, shaping policy in Manchuria, and enforcing militarist doctrine in Tokyo, Tojo stood at the intersection of ideology, administration, and military power. His reputation for discipline, efficiency, and unshakable loyalty to the emperor made him the ideal candidate to assume a more prominent role in national governance that would soon reshape the fate of Japan and the world. In July of that year, Tojo was appointed Army Minister in the Second Cabinet of Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. Though ostensibly a subordinate position within the civilian government, the role of Army Minister during this time carried extraordinary weight. Japan was in the midst of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and military leadership increasingly dominated political life. The Konoe government sought to bring together factions across the military and civilian spheres to forge a path forward amid a deteriorating global climate, and Tojo, representing the Toseiha military faction, was seen as a bridge between the army and the civilian bureaucracy. The world order was rapidly shifting. Germany had overrun France, the Low Countries, and much of Eastern Europe. In Asia, the colonial empires of Britain, France, and the Netherlands appeared vulnerable. Japan's leaders, emboldened by these changes, saw an opportunity to expand their empire and assert hegemony over East Asia. This vision crystallized in the formulation of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere concept that Tojo and his peers championed as a utopian alternative to Western imperialism, but which in practice masked naked expansionism and brutal colonial rule. Tojo was a militant ultranationalist, yet he was also seen as reasonable in that he was methodical, professional, and more predictable than some of the younger radicals in the officer corps. Prime Minister Konoe saw value in that steadiness. He believed that Tojo, with his deep connections in the military and strong bureaucratic skills, could help the government achieve its aims of consolidating power and winning concessions from the West without necessarily resorting to war. But this hope would prove tragically misplaced. Throughout 1940 and 1941, Tojo remained committed to military solutions to Japan's problems, even as Konoe and his advisors attempted to negotiate with the United States and Britain. Japan's goal chiefly, ending the war in China on favorable terms, maintaining influence over French Indochina, and securing raw materials for its war economy ran directly counter to Western interests. And as the United States imposed increasingly harsh economic sanctions, culminating in a total oil embargo in August 1941, Tojo and others became convinced that Japan had no choice but to strike preemptively. Internally, there were sharp divisions. Konoe still believed that a negotiated settlement might be possible, particularly through German mediation, but many in the army, especially Tojo, saw this as naive. In Tojo's eyes, America's demands, particularly its insistence on Japan withdrawing from China and Indochina, were not just unacceptable, they were existential threats to Japan's honor, security, and imperial mission. The conflict between Konoe's diplomacy and Tojo's hawkishness reached a breaking point in October 1941. With negotiations going nowhere, and under pressure from his military ministers, Konoe resigned. The emperor, advised by Kei, Ichikito, and the Jushin, elder statesmen, chose Tojo to succeed him as prime minister. The appointment was not universally celebrated. Some feared Tojo would lead Japan directly into war. But the rationale behind the choice was calculated. Only a military man like Tojo, it was thought, could unite the army and government in these turbulent times. Moreover, the emperor believed that Tojo's deep loyalty to the imperial institution might make him a moderating force. Upon being summoned by Emperor Hirohito on October 17, 1941, Tojo was given one direct order: re-examine Japan's current policies and the feasibility of peace. Though publicly a hardliner, Tojo accepted the task, pledging to conduct a sincere policy review. For a brief moment, the possibility of avoiding war remained alive. In private meetings, however, Tojo and his advisors saw little hope. The United States, under President Franklin D. W. Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, refused to ease economic sanctions unless Japan agreed to complete withdrawal from China and an end to aggression. This was a non-starter for the Japanese military, which viewed its conquests in China as sacrosanct. Tojo, like many of his peers, believed that retreat would demoralize the military, betray the sacrifices of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and fatally undermine Japan's claim to regional leadership. When Hull delivered the so-called Hull Note to Japanese diplomats on November 26, 1941, demanding unconditional withdrawal from China and Indochina, Tojo presented the document to his cabinet as an ultimatum, though it technically was not. Tojo used this moment to galvanize consensus for war, arguing that the note left Japan no room for compromise. This interpretation was not universally accepted, but in the fevered atmosphere of the time, it carried weight. In reality, many Japanese officials, including Tojo, believed that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States, yet they hoped that a sudden, massive blow crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and rapidly conquering Southeast Asia might force Washington to the negotiating table. This illusion of a short, decisive conflict would soon unravel. On December 1, 1941, the Imperial Conference gave its final approval for war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. Tojo, now fully in control of both the civilian government and the army, was the man most responsible for executing the war policy. 1 week later, on December 8 in Tokyo, December 7 in the U.S., he announced Japan's entry into the war via a radio address. The speech was filled with familiar rhetoric about Japan's righteous cause, its duty to liberate Asia, and its determination to resist Western domination. In truth, Tojo was unleashing a war that would bring devastation on a scale unimaginable to most of his countrymen. In the early days of victory, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese public hailed him as a hero. But behind the triumph lay a strategy built on violence, forced labor, terror, and unsustainable overreach. As 1941 turned to 1942, Hideki Tojo stood at the height of his power. He was prime minister, army minister, and effectively the chief architect of Japan's war. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. But the war he had hoped to control would soon begin to consume the very nation he claimed to defend. Part 5. Expansion, Atrocity, and Wartime Leadership. The months following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor witnessed a string of dazzling victories for the Empire of Japan. Under Hideki Tojo's wartime leadership, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific, toppling colonial outposts and driving the Western powers from positions they had held for generations. Tojo, as both prime minister and army minister, was hailed by the Japanese press as a national savior and the executor of divine imperial will. Yet beneath the veneer of military success, ominous currents of violence and overreach were beginning to emerge as signs that the ambitions of Japan's ruling class had far outpaced the reality of their strategic position. From December 1941 to mid-1942, Japan achieved what many considered impossible. Hong Kong fell in weeks. Singapore, believed by the British to be an impregnable fortress, surrendered in February 1942. The Philippines were taken after a grueling campaign that culminated in the infamous Bataan Death March. In rapid succession, the Japanese military conquered Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, Guam, Wake Island, and parts of New Guinea. With each victory, Japan's empire grew, and Tojo's popularity soared. But conquest came at a cost. The territories seized by Japan were subjected to brutal occupation policies, designed not only to strip resources, but also to instill fear and compliance. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, marketed as a liberation from Western imperialism, quickly revealed its true naturone of military dominance, forced labor, exploitation, and widespread atrocities. Tojo's government embraced and institutionalized these policies. Civilians across Asia were subjected to mass violence, massacres, forced relocations, starvation policies, and systematic sexual slavery. Perhaps the most infamous example of this was the comfort women system, in which tens of thousands of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, Taiwan, and other regions were coerced or forcibly taken into sexual servitude to serve Japanese soldiers in military brothels. In March 1942, as Army Minister, Tojo personally signed off on the shipment of comfort women from Taiwan to Borneo, providing written authorization in violation of peacetime travel protocols, an act that proves his full awareness and endorsement of the practice. Prisoners of war, POWs captured during Japan's campaigns, suffered immensely under Tojo's rule. Allied troops, especially those taken during the fall of Singapore and the Philippines, were subjected to starvation, forced labor on infrastructure projects like the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, and routine physical abuse. Death rates among Allied POWs under Japanese custody were far higher than under the Germans or Italians. Japanese military ideology, heavily influenced by Bushido, regarded surrender as dishonorable, and by extension, treated captured soldiers as less than human. This dehumanization contributed to countless violations of the Geneva Convention's violations that would later be used as evidence against Tojo at his war crimes trial. As Prime Minister, Tojo maintained tight control over both domestic policy and war planning. He not only served concurrently as Army Minister, but also took on the positions of Home Minister, Education Minister, Minister of Commerce and Industry, and briefly Foreign Minister. Each of these roles served a function in consolidating his grip on Japan's wartime apparatus. As Education Minister in 1943, he further expanded Japan's militaristic indoctrination of youth, embedding loyalty to the emperor and sacrifice for the nation into every level of the school system. Under his stewardship, textbooks and curricula were purged of liberal ideas and reoriented toward total war. Tojo also directed efforts to militarize Japan's economy. With the resources of Southeast Asia flowing into Japanese ports, his administration sought to maximize the exploitation of raw materials, including oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Malaya. However, logistics and industrial capacity quickly became overstretched. The rapid conquests left Japan responsible for vast territories. It lacked the manpower and infrastructure to govern effectively. What began as a strategic masterstroke soon morphed into a logistical nightmare, as supply chains broke down and resistance movements, backed by the Allies, began to rise in places like the Philippines, Burma, and Malaya. Internationally, Japan's war crimes and oppressive rule eroded any chance of Asian solidarity. The Pan-Asian rhetoric of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere rang hollow in places where Japanese troops committed atrocities. In China, the war, now 5 years old, showed no signs of resolution. The puppet government of Wang Jingwei, installed by Japan to replace Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, had little legitimacy and even less power. Attempts to gain Chinese cooperation failed, as the people largely remained loyal to either the nationalists or the communists. Meanwhile, resistance movements only intensified. While these realities began to erode Japan's international standing, Tojo remained firmly committed to his vision. He believed that decisive victories would eventually compel the United States and Britain to accept a negotiated peace. To this end, he endorsed the strategy of expanding and fortifying Japan's defensive perimeter, particularly in the Pacific. He oversaw the militarization of the Mariana Islands, the Carolines, and the Solomons, intending to create an impregnable shield around the home islands. American air superiority and naval power, however, would soon put this plan to the test. One of the first signs of vulnerability appeared in April 1942, when U.S. bombers carried out the Doolittle-Raiden audacious airstrike that bombed Tokyo and other cities. Though the physical damage was minimal, the psychological impact was profound. The raid pierced the illusion of invincibility that Tojo's government had fostered. Although he opposed the execution of the captured American pilots, fearing retaliation against Japanese POWs, Tojo was overruled, in part, and several flyers were executed with the emperor's quiet approval, a decision shrouded in secrecy and indicative of the regime's continued cruelty. Even as the tide of war subtly began to shift, Tojo continued to project an image of absolute control, but his internal position was less secure than it appeared. By late 1942 and into 1943, opposition began to grow within the government and military. Cabinet ministers grew restless with Tojo's accumulation of power, and friction with naval leadership intensified as Japan's strategic setbacks multiplied. Nevertheless, Tojo remained the fulcrum of wartime decision-making. In November 1943, he convened the Greater East Asia Conference in Tokyo, a propaganda event meant to show solidarity among Japan's Asian allies and satellite states. Delegates from puppet regimes, including Wang Jingwei's China, Ba Mao's Burma, and Subhas Chandra Bose's Indian National Army, attended. Tojo delivered grandiose speeches about Asian unity and anti-colonialism. But the empty declarations of brotherhood could not conceal the reality that most of the territories represented were under brutal Japanese military rule. The conference was a theatrical gesture, with no real diplomatic impact. By 1944, the consequences of Japan's imperial overreach were beginning to coalesce. American forces were advancing inexorably across the Pacific. China remained defiant. The economy was strained. Civilian morale was declining. Yet Hideki Tojo persisted in pursuing victory through expansion, repression, and stubborn ideological rigidity. The prime minister, who had risen on a tide of military triumph, was now slowly being dragged toward the edge of defeat. In the months ahead, Japan's fortunes would change decisively, and Tojo's iron grip on power would begin to falter. Part 6. Strategic Overreach and the Collapse of the Imperial Dream. By early 1944, it had become clear to some in Japan's upper echelons that the tide of the war had irrevocably shifted. The dazzling victories of 1941 and 1942 were now distant memories. While Japanese propaganda continued to broadcast images of strength and resolve, Hideki Tojo privately grappled with the harsh reality that the Allied powers led by the United States were gaining ground in both the Pacific and China. His grandiose vision of a Pan-Asian empire was crumbling under the weight of logistical overextension, industrial shortages, and military defeats. As Allied forces advanced, Tojo pursued an aggressive counteroffensive to reverse the situation. In January 1944, he approved the initiation of Operation Ichigo, the largest Japanese land offensive of the entire war. It was designed to achieve several strategic aims: to crush the remaining nationalist Chinese resistance, seize Allied airbases in China that were threatening Japan's home islands, and finally bring China to heel under Japanese dominance. The campaign involved over 500 Japanese troops and covered more than 500 miles of Chinese territory, including Hunan, Henan, and Guangxi provinces. On paper, Operation Ichigo was a success. Japanese forces seized key rail lines and cities, and temporarily disrupted American bombing operations from Chinese bases. But the offensive failed to achieve its ultimate goal, breaking Chinese resistance. The campaign drained manpower and resources, and instead of freeing up divisions for use elsewhere, it entangled Japan deeper into the Chinese quagmire. Despite enormous territorial gains, the operation did little to change the strategic picture of the war and further strained Japan's already overextended military. While Operation Ichigo was unfolding in China, Japan pursued another ambitious and ultimately disastrous offensive in India. Known as Operation Yugo, this campaign was masterminded by General Masakazu Kawabe and supported by Tojo, with the backing of Emperor Hirohito himself. The aim was to strike into British India through Burma, disrupt Allied supply lines into China, and provoke a mass uprising among Indian nationalists that would topple British colonial rule. The offensive began in March 1944. With the 15th Army marching into the Indian states of Manipur and Assam. It included close cooperation with Subhas Chandra Bose, the exiled Indian nationalist leader, and his Indian National Army, INA, which was supported and trained by the Japanese. Bose hoped that Japanese intervention would help free India, while Tojo saw Bose as a useful instrument to destabilize the British Raj and extend Japan's influence into the Indian subcontinent. However, the Japanese grossly underestimated the logistical challenges of operating in the harsh jungle and mountainous terrain of northeast India. The monsoon rains turned roads into rivers of mud, cutting off Japanese supply lines. Troops began to starve and succumb to disease. At the Battle of Imphal and Battle of Kohima, the British and Indian forces decisively repelled the Japanese advance. The defeat was catastrophic. More than 70 Japanese troops were killed, and many more died of disease and starvation. The entire concept of marching to Delhi with local support turned out to be a fantasy. The Indian population, far from rising in rebellion, largely remained loyal to the British, and many fought bravely in defense of India against the Japanese-led invasion. These twin campaigns in China and India, both pursued under Tojo's direction, highlighted the strategic overreach of his government. Rather than consolidating and defending Japan's existing conquests, Tojo doubled down on expansion, believing that offensive success could still change the tide of war. But the cost was immense. These offensives depleted Japan's resources, bled its military strength, and left it even more vulnerable to the advancing Allied forces in the Pacific. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, Tojo attempted to consolidate his authority amid growing discontent. In February 1944, after the loss of the vital naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands to a devastating American air raid, Tojo dismissed Admiral Osami Nagano as Navy Chief of Staff, blaming him for the security failures. Seeking to centralize control and take personal command of the war effort, Tojo appointed himself Chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff in addition to already serving as Prime Minister and Army Minister. This unprecedented concentration of power made Tojo effectively the military and political head of Japan, directly responsible for nearly every major decision regarding strategy, personnel, and policy. Tojo believed that Japan's salvation lay in winning the decisive battle clash with American forces that would cripple U.S. momentum and force a negotiated peace. The target of this vision was the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, which served as strategic stepping stones to the Japanese homeland. The Marianas were not only critical militarily but also psychologically. Losing them would mean that U.S. B-29 bombers could strike the Japanese home islands with relative ease. In June 1944, the Battle of Saipan began. The Japanese fiercely defended the island, but the overwhelming power of American naval and air forces proved too great. By mid-July, Saipan had fallen. The cost was catastrophic: over 70 Japanese military and civilian deaths. Entire families committed mass suicide rather than surrender. The loss of Saipan sent shockwaves through the Japanese leadership and public. It was the first time Japanese civilians had died en masse in battle, and it shattered the myth that Japan was winning the war. At the same time, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy suffered what would become known to the Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, losing hundreds of aircraft and many of its finest pilots. The battle effectively destroyed Japan's ability to wage carrier-based naval warfare. Despite earlier hopes, the long-awaited decisive battle had come and it had been a disaster. These military defeats led to a political reckoning in Tokyo. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Tojo since 1941 began to dissipate. Supporters and rivals alike blamed him for the mounting failures. Emperor Hirohito, who had hitherto supported Tojo, began to question whether he should remain in power. Behind the scenes, Japan's elder statesman, or Jushin, began organizing to demand his resignation. By July 1944, with morale collapsing and confidence in his leadership eroding, Tojo offered to reorganize his cabinet. But the emperor refused partial measures. He wanted a full resignation, not just a reshuffling. Stripped of support from the throne, Tojo resigned all his posts on July 18, 1944, ending one of the most consequential and controversial premierships in Japanese history. Tojo's fall did not mark the end of Japan's wartime struggle, but it did mark the conclusion of an era in which aggressive militarism, expansionism, and imperial ideology dominated Japanese policy under a single man's guiding hand. For nearly 3 years, Hideki Tojo had directed a brutal campaign of conquest that brought devastation to much of Asia. Now, with the war turning decisively against Japan, he would soon face judgment for the consequences of his ambitions. Part 7. Defeat, Resignation, and the Empire's Unraveling. The resignation of Hideki Tojo on July 18, 1944, marked a turning point in Japan's war. It was more than the fall of a prime minister, it was the symbolic collapse of the militarist optimism that had fueled Japan's expansion since 1937. Tojo's departure came on the heels of humiliating defeats in Saipan, the Philippine Sea, and the Yugo offensive in India, all of which exposed the fragility of Japan's overstretched empire. With him fell the myth of Japanese invincibility, and even within the high command, murmurs of doom grew louder. Tojo's resignation had been prompted not only by military collapse, but also by a loss of confidence from the one figure he had most loyally served, Emperor Hirohito. For much of his tenure, Tojo had acted as the mouthpiece of imperial will, executing policies aligned with the emperor's directives. However, once the Battle of Saipan ended in catastrophe, even Hirohito Wansei, steadfast in his support, began to distance himself. The emperor's message to Tojo, denying him public affirmation, signaled to Japan's elite that the prime minister no longer enjoyed sacred backing. The Lord Privy Seal, Koichi Kido, orchestrated his removal by leaking the imperial disapproval to powerful political figures. In a last attempt to retain influence, Tojo proposed to reorganize his cabinet, but Hirohito firmly rejected the half measure. He demanded a total resignation. Deprived of imperial favor, Tojo had no political base to shield him. Though he had been the most powerful man in Japan, serving as prime minister, and army chief of staff, his authority crumbled overnight. He was replaced by General Kuniaki Koiso, a less assertive figure who represented a temporary compromise among competing factions, but had little hope of reversing Japan's deteriorating position. Despite Tojo's fall, Japan's war machine ground on. The fundamental structures he helped build, the war ministries, total mobilization of society, ideological indoctrination, and military command networks remained intact. Many of his policies continued without interruption. His exit removed a prominent face, but not the systemic militarism embedded in the government. Yet, it was clear to all that Japan was now on the defensive, with every campaign a desperate attempt to slow inevitable defeat. In the months following his resignation, Tojo withdrew from public life and entered what would become the final chapter of his involvement in state affairs. Though no longer in power, he remained an influential figure in military circles. Behind closed doors, he met with former colleagues, wrote reflections on the war effort, and tried to shape the narrative of his premiership. He maintained that Japan had been forced into the conflict by Western aggression, particularly American economic sanctions, and framed the war as a defensive necessity to protect Asia from colonial subjugation. Even in private, Tojo never expressed remorse for the destruction wrought by Japanese forces. He continued to justify the invasion of China and the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor as acts of strategic necessity. His belief in the supremacy of the Japanese state and the emperor's divine role remained unshaken. Though stripped of formal authority, he regarded himself as a faithful servant of the empire, who had only carried out the will of the sovereign and the nation. In early 1945, as Allied bombing raids began to devastate Japan's cities and the tide of war turned into a torrent of destruction, Tojo's legacy came under further scrutiny. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 incinerated tens of thousands of civilians. The nation was starving, cities were leveled, and the once mighty Imperial Navy had been reduced to a defensive fleet. Still, the military elite, even without Tojo at the helm, refused to consider surrender. The grip of the militarist ideology that Tojo had long embodied remained tight. Then came the decisive events of the summer. The Battle of Okinawa in April-June 1945 was among the bloodiest of the Pacific War. Over 200 people perished, Japanese soldiers, civilians, and American troops alike. The ferocity of the fighting shocked even Japan's hardened leaders. Despite this, Tokyo still rejected the Potsdam Declaration, an Allied ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender. That defiance came at a terrible price. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Manchuria, crushing the Kwantung Army that had once been Tojo's stronghold. These catastrophic events forced Japan's hand. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito made the unprecedented decision to address the Japanese people by radio, announcing the nation's surrender. For Tojo, the moment was devastating. The imperial dream he had so fervently upheld had collapsed in ashes. The military code he had devoted his life to had ended in defeat, surrender, and foreign occupation. In the aftermath, Japan was occupied by Allied forces under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. One of MacArthur's first priorities was to hold Japan's wartime leaders accountable. Hideki Tojo, as the most visible symbol of Japan's military government and a chief architect of its expansionist wars, was at the top of the list. His time as a private citizen would not last long. On September 11, 1945, 5 American soldiers arrived at Tojo's home in Setagaya, Tokyo, to place him under arrest for war crimes. But rather than allow himself to be taken immediately, Tojo attempted to take his own life. He retreated to a private room, pointed a pistol to his chest, and pulled the trigger. The bullet missed his heart. Tojo collapsed in a pool of blood, still alive but gravely wounded. When American medics arrived, they rushed to save his life not out of sympathy, but because they intended for him to stand trial. As he bled, Tojo muttered to Japanese journalists present, "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die." It was an eerie echo of the samurai code he had worshipped, where honor was preserved through self-inflicted death. But unlike his idealized vision of warriors from the past, Tojo's gesture failed. His botched suicide would become emblematic of the collapse of the militarist mythos he had championed. He would live on not as a hero, but as a defendant in a global tribunal. The man who once commanded an empire that stretched from Burma to New Guinea, who had ordered invasions and governed with ruthless efficiency, now faced the judgment of the international community. The war that had defined his life had ended, and history was preparing to deliver its verdict. Part 8. Judgment in Tokyo. After his failed suicide attempt in September 1945, Hideki Tojo lay wounded in an American military hospital. Though barely clinging to life after shooting himself in the chest, American medical personnel worked urgently to save him not from compassion, but to ensure that he would stand trial. His capture and prosecution were essential to the Allied mission to hold Japanese leadership accountable for the atrocities and aggression of World War II. As Tojo recovered in custody, his physical weakness did little to diminish the international spotlight now focused on him. The American press, which had demonized him for years as the face of Japanese militarism, followed his recovery with intense interest. In Japan, too, news of his arrest marked the beginning of a painful reckoning with the country's catastrophic defeat. The former prime minister had become a living symbol of Japan's aggressive war and, for many Japanese, a scapegoat upon whom they could heap blame while distancing themselves from the horrors of the past. Following his recovery, Tojo was transferred to Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, where he was held alongside other high-profile suspects. In this grim facility, the very men who had wielded imperial power now languished as prisoners, awaiting the judgment of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, also known as the Tokyo Trials. Modeled after the Nuremberg trials in Europe, the Tokyo Tribunal was a joint Allied effort to prosecute leaders of Imperial Japan for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The proceedings began in May 1946, with Tojo as the most prominent defendant among 28 accused Class A war criminals. His official charges included waging wars of aggression, violating international law, and presiding over atrocities such as massacres, starvation, forced labor, and mistreatment of prisoners of war. Crimes under his leadership extended across vast swaths of Asia, from the rape of Nanking to atrocities in the Philippines, Burma, China, Korea, and the Dutch East Indies. Throughout the trial, Tojo's demeanor was stoic and resolute. From the outset, he accepted responsibility for his role in Japan's war, though not without nuance. In his opening testimony, Tojo declared, "It is natural that I should bear entire responsibility for the war in general, and, needless to say, I am prepared to do so. Now that the war has been lost, it is presumably necessary that I be judged so that the circumstances of the time can be clarified and the future peace of the world be assured." However, this apparent contrition masked deeper complexities. While Tojo acknowledged his responsibility as prime minister and military leader, he also sought to portray the war as a necessary response to Western imperialism and economic strangulation, particularly the American oil embargo. He continued to frame Japan's actions as defensive, designed to secure self-sufficiency and liberate Asia from colonial domination. In doing so, he hoped to cast the conflict in terms of geopolitical necessity rather than criminal aggression. But many in the courtroom were unconvinced. Evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. Witness after witness, document after document, detailed the horrific toll of Japanese actions under Tojo's watch. The use of forced labor, medical experimentation, the widespread deployment of comfort women, and systematic torture and execution of prisoners. The massacre at Manila, the Bataan Death March, and numerous atrocities in China and Southeast Asia were all linked to Japanese military policy carried out under his administration. Particularly damning was Tojo's role in authorizing and overseeing the military structure that had facilitated these crimes. Though he did not order every atrocity, prosecutors argued, he had created the conditions for them to occur, empowered those who carried them out, and made no effort to stop or punish them. His centralization of military power serving simultaneously as Prime Minister, Army Minister, and Chief of the Army General Staff meant that responsibility could not be delegated or deflected. Tojo's testimony touched on many sensitive subjects, including his belief in the emperor's divinity and the kokutai, Japan's unique national polity. However, when he strayed from the official narrative that exonerated Emperor Hirohito, the prosecution reacted swiftly. The United States and other allies had decided early in the occupation that preserving the emperor's image was vital to ensuring a smooth transition to peace. Therefore, when Tojo implied that the emperor held ultimate authority over military decisions, he was quietly pressured to retract the statement. Through intermediaries, most notably, former General Ryukichi Tanaka Tojo was urged to revise his testimony to emphasize his sole responsibility for wartime decisions. In subsequent statements, Tojo did just that, stating plainly that he had made the ultimate decisions, thereby shielding Hirohito from prosecution. Historians such as Herbert Bix and John Dower have sharply criticized this manipulation, arguing that the trials were compromised by Allied efforts to absolve the imperial institution and focus blame exclusively on figures like Tojo. Despite this, Tojo remained unflinching in his resolve. During the long months of the trial, he read voraciously, wrote extensively, and insisted that truth be the guiding principle of the proceedings. In private conversations, he expressed bitterness at what he saw as victor's justice, but outwardly, he conducted himself with discipline and dignity. The Tokyo trial stretched on for more than 2 years. Finally, on November 12, 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Hideki Tojo was found guilty on multiple counts, including crimes against peace, murder, and the waging of aggressive war. He was sentenced to death by hanging. 6 other high-ranking leaders were sentenced to the same fate, and they would all die together. Tojo accepted the judgment without protest. In his final statement before execution, he expressed remorse for the suffering caused by the war and urged the American occupiers to treat the Japanese people with compassion. He again emphasized his sense of responsibility and called for future peace. "I am sincerely sorry for the atrocities committed by the Japanese military. I hope the American military will show mercy to the Japanese people who have suffered so much." On December 23, 1948, just 1 week shy of his 64th birthday, Hideki Tojo was hanged at Sugamo Prison. His death marked the end of an era not just for one man, but for the imperial ideology he had represented. His remains were cremated by the U.S. military, and his ashes scattered over the Pacific Ocean, a symbolic erasure of a figure who had once aspired to rule it. But the story of Hideki Tojo would not end with his execution. Part 9. The Ghost of Empire. The execution of Hideki Tojo on December 23, 1948, was intended by the Allied victors to symbolize justice and closure. Alongside 6 other condemned Class A war criminals, Tojo was hanged in the early hours of the morning in the gallows of Sugamo Prison, Tokyo. His body, like those of the others, was cremated shortly thereafter by U.S. Army personnel. But what happened next remained a mystery for decades. To prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for nationalist extremists, the United States military chose to secretly scatter Tojo's ashes over the Pacific Ocean, roughly 30 miles east of Yokohama. The operation was conducted discreetly on the same day as his execution, with military precision. For years, the details were classified, feeding speculation and rumor. It was only in 2021, with the declassification of U.S. Army documents, that the public learned the full story of how the man once hailed as the architect of Japan's expansionist ambitions had been erased from the earth, his physical remains consigned to the vast ocean his navy had once sought to dominate. Yet, despite this symbolic obliteration, Hideki Tojo's legacy endured and continues to provoke controversy, revisionism, and reflection both within Japan and abroad. In post-war Japan, as the nation was rebuilt under American occupation and later became a pacifist democracy, Tojo's image was largely discredited. Most Japanese people came to view him as a tragic figure, one who had led the country into a disastrous war and paid the ultimate price. But among a vocal minority, particularly within ultranationalist circles, Tojo began to be reframed not as a criminal, but as a patriot who had sacrificed himself for the nation's survival. This counter-narrative found one of its most symbolic expressions in the Yasukuni Shrine, a Shinto memorial dedicated to Japan's war dead. In 1978, Tojo and the other executed Class A war criminals were enshrined at Yasukuni, prompting outrage across Asia. For many in China, South Korea, and other countries once occupied by Japan, the inclusion of war criminals among the shrine's honored spirits was nothing less than a glorification of militarism and atrocity. The controversy escalated whenever Japanese political leaders visited the shrine. Each visit, especially by a sitting prime minister's, was met with protests, diplomatic protests, and even threats of severed relations by neighboring countries. Tojo's name thus remained a political fault line, emblematic of unresolved wartime memory and historical denial. In an even more literal expression of his legacy, Tojo's graveyard, what purported to be a resting place, was established in Hazu, Aichi Prefecture. Referred to as the Grave of the Seven Martyrs, it houses the ashes of Tojo and the 6 others executed alongside him. According to reports, sympathizers secretly collected and preserved fragments of their remains before the full scattering at sea. The grave became a shrine for far-right nationalists, leading to heightened tensions. In 1971, it became the target of a bombing attack by the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front, a radical leftist group protesting the resurgence of militarist nostalgia. The ideological battlefield over Tojo's memory extended into his family line. His granddaughter, Yuko Tojo, emerged as a vocal public figure in the 2000s, seeking to restore her grandfather's honor. She ran for political office and made repeated public statements, claiming that Japan's war was a war of self-defense, that Tojo had been unfairly tried, and that Japan had liberated Asia from Western colonialism. Though she failed to win office, her candidacy reflected a broader trend in Japan toward historical revisionism, in which certain politicians and scholars began to downplay or reinterpret Japan's wartime actions. Internationally, Tojo's name remains deeply divisive. In China, he is often cited as the epitome of wartime brutality, and his image is taught to students as a lesson in the horrors of fascism and militarism. In a 1,997 survey of Chinese university students, Tojo was the most commonly named Japanese figure when asked about Japan, reflecting both the depth of resentment and the enduring scars of the Sino-Japanese War. In popular culture, Tojo has been portrayed in a variety of ways, some serious, others sensational. Films such as Tora, 1970, and Pride, 1998. Depict him through different lenses. The latter, a Japanese production, controversially portrays him as a hero unjustly tried by victor's justice. In music, literature, and even professional wrestling, his name has been invoked symbolically, often as shorthand for Japanese aggression during the Second World War. Meanwhile, historians continue to debate his motivations, legacy, and culpability. While some scholars, like Herbert Bix and John W. Dower, have stressed the systemic nature of the militarist ideology that produced Tojo, others have focused more on his personal ambition, bureaucratic efficiency, and fanatical adherence to the imperial institution. These debates extend to the controversial decision by the American occupation authorities to exonerate Emperor Hirohito, a decision many believe was made for geopolitical stability rather than strict justice. Tojo, in many ways, was the perfect scapegoat for a defeated empire. He was uncharismatic, stern, and lacking in poetic mystique. Unlike other leaders such as Mussolini or Hitler, he inspired little admiration, even among his contemporaries. Yet his bureaucratic rise, blind obedience, and cold efficiency made him an embodiment of the militarist machinery that led Japan into catastrophe. In death, Tojo became more than a man, he became a mirror. For Japan, he reflected the darkness of an era many would rather forget. For Asia, he remained a symbol of oppression and pain. For the United States, he was the justification for total war and ultimate victory. And for the world, he served as one of the clearest reminders of what happens when ideology, militarism, and unchecked power converge in a man convinced he is serving a sacred destiny. Part 10. The Machinery of Death. Though Hideki Tojo's name is most often associated with his political leadership during World War II and his symbolic role as Japan's wartime prime minister, historians and jurists alike have emphasized that his greatest legacy lies in the immense suffering inflicted under his authority. This legacy is not merely one of bad leadership or failed diplomacy, it is one of active complicity in systemic war crimes. Crimes that continue to haunt East Asia and the broader conscience of the international community. During Tojo's tenure as prime minister and concurrently as army minister and later chief of staff of the Imperial Japanese Army, Japan's military forces carried out atrocities on a massive scale, not only against enemy soldiers but also against civilians, prisoners of war, and occupied populations. Though Tojo himself rarely issued specific field orders for massacres or torture, he was at the very center of the command structure that enabled, authorized, and defended the policies of total war and unrestrained violence carried out in the name of the emperor. Among the most notorious of these policies was the use of comfort women, a euphemism for women and girls, many of them Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, and Southeast Asian, who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. The system was established ostensibly to prevent soldiers from raping local women, but in practice, it became one of the largest institutionalized networks of sexual exploitation in modern history. As Minister of the Army, Tojo not only sanctioned the expansion of this system into newly conquered territories but also oversaw its logistical and administrative support, personally authorizing the transport of women for use in frontline brothels. Furthermore, during the war's prosecution, Tojo presided over policies that resulted in the deaths of millions, both directly through acts of violence and indirectly through starvation, forced labor, and neglect. Among the worst episodes was the treatment of Allied prisoners of war, particularly British, Australian, American, and Dutch captives in Southeast Asia. These prisoners were subjected to forced labor under brutal conditions, with the construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, often called the Death Railway, resulting in the deaths of over 100 men, including tens of thousands of Asian laborers forcibly conscripted into service. Tojo's government also implemented policies of mass starvation in occupied regions such as China, Indonesia, and the Philippines, as local food resources were redirected to feed Japanese troops. Entire villages were left to die, especially in areas that resisted occupation. In China alone, Japanese forces under Tojo's broad strategic direction engaged in repeated campaigns of massacre, such as those in Chengde, Wuxiang, and Henan, compounding the trauma already inflicted during the infamous Nanjing massacre a few years earlier. While Tojo did not serve as prime minister during Nanjing, his role in continuing the war of conquest and refusal to hold anyone accountable amounted to a tacit endorsement of such behavior. One particularly grisly component of Japan's wartime cruelty was the operation of Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit based in Manchuria. This unit conducted human experimentation on prisoners, often civilians, including vivisections, exposure to pathogens, and lethal experiments without anesthesia. Though evidence directly tying Tojo to the day-to-day operations of Unit 731 remains elusive, as Army Minister and then Prime Minister, he authorized the budget and structure under which it operated, and he failed to stop its activities or prosecute its perpetrators. According to post-war estimates, the total civilian death toll attributed to Imperial Japan during the Second World War ranges between 3 million and 14 million people. These figures include victims of massacres, man-made famines, medical experimentation, forced labor, and aerial bombing. The scale and horror of these acts are comparable to, and in some cases exceed, the crimes committed by the Axis powers in Europe. And in East and Southeast Asia, these atrocities remain part of living memory, continually shaping relations between Japan and its neighbors. Tojo's government also contributed to the deliberate cultural destruction of occupied territories. In Korea and Taiwan, schools were forced to adopt Japanese language curricula, names were changed, and cultural practices suppressed. Religious practices that deviated from Shinto or threatened Japanese dominance were discouraged or banned. In many regions, sacred texts, historical artifacts, and documents were looted or destroyed as part of a broad effort to Japanize the imperial dominion. In post-war trials, many of these crimes were the basis for Tojo's prosecution by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The charges laid against him included waging aggressive war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While Tojo himself did not contest many of the facts, his defense team argued that he was carrying out the emperor's will, a line that was encouraged by the occupying American administration seeking to shield Emperor Hirohito from prosecution. As a result, Tojo became a sort of sacrificial symbolone who bore the sins of the nation, even as others who shared responsibility were spared. In his final statement before execution, Tojo expressed regret for Japan's defeat and the suffering it caused, but he never fully accepted responsibility for the mass death and brutality that had occurred under his rule. He maintained that he had acted for the good of the nation, in loyalty to the emperor, and in defense against Western imperialism. This sense of righteous duty, however, twisted was central to his identity, even as the world condemned him as a war criminal. Historians have since struggled to pin down whether Tojo was a true ideological fanatic or simply a military bureaucrat who let the machinery of empire run unimpeded. Either way, his signature appears again and again on documents that ordered mobilization, approved execution, and expanded conquest. Whether or not he personally enjoyed wielding power, he was ultimately responsible for how that power was used. As the world continues to reckon with the legacies of World War II, Hideki Tojo remains a central figure in the narrative of Japanese aggression and brutality. His role was not that of a mad tyrant or charismatic populist, but rather that of a cold, disciplined servant of empire. Precisely the kind of man who makes systematic violence possible. Part 11. Collapse and Resignation. By early 1944, the Japanese empire that Hideki Tojo had overseen for nearly 3 years was beginning to crack under the weight of its overreach. The dreams of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had not only failed to materialize, they had turned into a nightmare of logistical chaos, popular resistance, and military setbacks. As the tide of war shifted dramatically in favor of the Allies, Tojo found himself increasingly isolated, facing opposition both within the military establishment and the political elite, even as he tried to hold together a fragmented and overstretched empire. Tojo had staked his legitimacy on the vision of ultimate victory through a series of bold, aggressive offensives. His confidence in a decisive campaign that would knock China out of the war through Operation Ichigo and deliver a crushing blow to British imperial rule via Operation Yugo in India proved tragically misplaced. The Battle of Imphal and Kohima, launched in March 1944, turned into a catastrophe. Not only were Japanese forces repelled, they suffered enormous losses due to starvation, disease, and logistical failure. Over 70 Japanese soldiers perished in the operation, many of them without ever encountering the enemy. The plan had relied on the assumption that local Indian populations would rise up against British rule, but the uprising never came. Instead, Indian troops serving under the British remained loyal and helped repel the invasion. Simultaneously, Operation Ichigo in China achieved mixed results. While Japanese forces succeeded in linking several occupied zones and eliminating some American air bases, the offensive failed to knock China out of the war or deliver a decisive blow. Moreover, the cost was immense in terms of manpower and resources, and it served only to deepen the quagmire Japan had been stuck in since 1937. As reports of these failures trickled back to Tokyo, discontent began to swell in both military and civilian circles. The Japanese Navy, already deeply resentful of the Army's dominance in war strategy, had suffered one of its most devastating defeats at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by the Americans, this battle saw the near annihilation of Japanese carrier-based air power. With the loss of Saipan in July 1944, the Marianas fell into American hand-sputting the Japanese home islands within direct range of B-29 strategic bombers for the first time. For many in the upper echelons of power, this was the final proof that the war was lost. Tojo had by this time assumed multiple roles in the government in an attempt to consolidate control. He was Prime Minister, Army Minister, and Chief of the Army General Staff. But this centralization of authority left him no room for deflection. Every military failure was now tied directly to his name. His opponents within the military and the political class, including senior figures like Admiral Keisuke Okada and Prince Fumimaro Konoe, began to lobby for his removal. Even Emperor Hirohito, who had supported Tojo's leadership until then, began to show signs of dissatisfaction. When Tojo proposed a cabinet reorganization to maintain his grip on power, the emperor refused to endorse it. In effect, Tojo lost the throne's confidence, a fatal blow in a society where imperial endorsement conferred ultimate legitimacy. On July 18, 1944, following a disastrous meeting with the emperor and mounting calls for his resignation, Hideki Tojo tendered his resignation. The entire cabinet followed him in stepping down. His fall from power was both swift and symbolic. The very man who had embodied Japan's militant ambitions and its wartime posture had now become the symbol of its overreach, its failure, and its impending collapse. Tojo's replacement, General Kuniaki Koiso, was selected not because of his capability, but because no one else wanted the job. Leading figures like Admiral Yonai had refused the post, believing that any prime minister who sought peace with the United States would be murdered by extremist officers in the army. This environment of fear and militaristic rigidity was part of the legacy Tojo left behind. Though his resignation ended his formal role in government, Tojo remained a powerful presence in the background, continuing to influence military affairs and state ideology. His downfall did not signal a change in policy. Japan would continue to fight on, with devastating consequences, for another full year. But within the inner circles of government, his departure marked the beginning of a fracturing consensus. No longer could Japan claim to be on the offensive. Now, the country was in retreat, and every military planner understood the grim arithmetic. The homeland was next. In hindsight, many contemporaries saw Tojo's resignation as too little, too late. By the time he stepped down, millions were already dead across Asia. The Japanese economy was in shambles, and the specter of invasion, bombing, and defeat loomed over the home islands. Yet Tojo himself, at this point, remained largely unrepentant. He believed that Japan's war had been just, its intentions noble, and its ultimate failure the result of Western intransigence and internal cowardice. That belief firmly rooted in a vision of Japan as a righteous, divinely guided empire under siege by hostile Western forces would carry Tojo through the end of the war and into the final chapter of his life: arrest, trial, and execution. Part 12. Surrender and arrest. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the Japanese Empire was crumbling on every front. With its naval power shattered and American bombers now attacking the Japanese mainland, life for civilians grew increasingly desperate. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were reduced to smoldering ruins, with the relentless firebombing campaigns killing hundreds of thousands and leaving millions homeless. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced steadily across the Pacific, island by island, edging closer to the Japanese home islands. For Hideki Tojo, now out of office, it must have been a bitter, humiliating spectacle to witness the unraveling of the empire he once claimed would dominate Asia for 1,000 years. Though Tojo no longer held political office, he remained a symbolic figure, still regarded by many as the architect of Japan's wartime policies and the central face of the failed war effort. His name had become synonymous with Japanese militarism in the West, reviled by Allied soldiers, caricatured in propaganda, and demonized in public discourse. As the war dragged on, Tojo faded into relative obscurity, maintaining a low profile. But he would not escape justice for long. The final blow came on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender in a radio broadcast. The long-awaited declaration stunned many, including those who had clung to fantasies of a decisive homeland battle. While others wept or prepared for suicide, Hideki Tojo, now 60 years old, quietly waited for the inevitable. He knew his fate had been sealed. Just weeks later, General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied powers, began the process of identifying and arresting individuals responsible for the war. 40 prominent Japanese leaders were placed on a list of war crimes, suspects, and Tojo's name was among the first. On September 11, 1945, 5 American soldiers were dispatched to arrest him at his residence in Setagaya, Tokyo. But Tojo had already made preparations. Clinging to the old samurai ideal of honorable suicide, he attempted to take his own life before being captured. As the Americans surrounded his home, Tojo retreated to a small room and used a borrowed pistol to shoot himself in the chest. However, the bullet missed his heart. Bleeding heavily but still alive, Tojo was found by the arresting soldiers, who rushed him to the hospital. His suicide note, filled with imperial rhetoric and appeals to patriotism, declared that he took full responsibility for Japan's failure in the war. "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die," he reportedly told the Americans as he was treated. Tojo's failed suicide, clumsy and incomplete, was in stark contrast to the thousands of Japanese officers and civilians who had chosen death over surrender during the war. The image of the former prime minister lying in a hospital bed, bandaged and feeble, became symbolic of a humiliated regime brought low. Some Japanese viewed him with pity, others with derision. In the West, newspapers ran headlines portraying Tojo as a coward who had tried to escape justice. Once recovered, Tojo was transferred to Sugamo Prison, where he would spend the next 2 years awaiting trial. The prison, managed by American personnel, housed many of Japan's most notorious wartime leaders. In his time there, Tojo presented himself as calm, reserved, and studiously polite. He reportedly spent hours reading Buddhist texts and military strategy, showing little outward remorse, though he often said he accepted responsibility for his decisions. One strange and widely discussed anecdote from his time in Sugamo involved his dentures. An American military dentist allegedly engraved the words, "Remember Pearl Harbor" in Morse code on Tojo's false teeth, a small act of symbolic vengeance. Though the message was later removed, it highlighted the level of emotion and bitterness that still surrounded Tojo's image, even among medical staff sworn to provide care. As the International Military Tribunal for the Far East was prepared in Tokyo, Japan's version of the Nuremberg trials, Tojo was ready to stand before the world as one of the principal defendants. He was accused of multiple war crimes, including waging aggressive war, violations of international law, and the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war and civilians. His guilt, at least in the eyes of many, was not in question. What remained to be seen was how Tojo would comport himself in the courtroom, and what truths or evasion she would offer under oath. In the coming months, the courtroom would become a theater of memory, blame, and historical revision. But Tojo's conduct during his imprisonment and his embrace of personal responsibility, however, partial would distinguish him from many of his contemporaries. Though he still believed in the cause for which Japan had gone to war, he would not shift the blame. He would speak for himself. And he would face his sentence with the stoicism of a soldier. The next chapter would bring him to the defendant's bench, where he would stand not just before the judges but before history itself. Part 13. Trial, Judgment, and Execution. The Tokyo Trials, officially known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, opened on May 3, 1946, in the shadow of Japan's defeat and the smoldering ruins of its imperial dreams. For the world, the trials represented an opportunity to assign accountability for the horrors of the Pacific War, and for many Japanese citizens, a moment of reckoning with their own complicity or victimhood in a catastrophic conflict. For Hideki Tojo, the tribunal was both the end of his journey and the stage upon which he would defend, justify, and ultimately surrender to justice. Tojo was the central figure among the 25 Japanese leaders indicted. Though the tribunal also included politicians, generals, and diplomats, none symbolized the war more profoundly than he did. In the eyes of the Allied prosecutors and much of the world, Tojo was the militarist in chief, the embodiment of Japan's aggressive nationalism and authoritarian rule. The charges against him were extensive and grave. He was indicted for Class A, crimes against peace, particularly the planning and waging of wars of aggression in China, Southeast Asia, and against the United States and the British Empire. He was also accused of authorizing, permitting, and enabling brutal crimes committed by the Imperial Japanese Army, including massacres, forced labor, starvation, torture, and human experimentation. Millions of civilians across Asia had perished as a result of policies enacted under his government. Some estimates placed the civilian death toll from Japanese military actions during Tojo's tenure between 3 and 14 million. From the beginning of the proceedings, Tojo was cooperative, controlled, and often stoically unemotional. He wore the khaki uniform of a Japanese officer, refusing to don civilian clothes, perhaps signaling that he still saw himself first and foremost as a soldier. In his initial statement, he accepted full responsibility for the war. This declaration stunned many observers. In a time when most defendants sought to distance themselves from accountability, Tojo's forthright acknowledgement stood out. It is natural that I should bear entire responsibility for the war in general. With respect to my trial, it is my intention to speak frankly. Even though when the vanquished stands before the victor, he may be apt to toady and flatter. I mean to say to the end that what is true, and what is false. However, Tojo's honesty did not mean remorse in the conventional sense. He insisted the war had been justified, that Japan had fought to free Asia from Western colonial domination, and that the conflict had been provoked by economic strangulation, particularly the U.S. oil embargo. He argued that Japan had no choice but to act or be subjugated. Throughout the trial, Tojo painted himself as a patriot acting under orders, loyal to the emperor and driven by national survival. Despite his acceptance of general responsibility, Tojo did not implicate Emperor Hirohito. In fact, he went to great lengths to protect the imperial institution. According to several historical sources, including historian Herbert P. Bix and John W. Dower, General MacArthur and his staff, particularly Brigadier General Bonner Fellers, had worked actively to shield the emperor from indictment. Fellers is said to have communicated to the Japanese leadership that it would be most convenient if they could absolve Hirohito of direct responsibility, and Tojo obliged, recasting decisions as entirely his own. At one point in the proceedings, Tojo briefly stated that ultimate authority rested with the emperor, contradicting the official narrative. Alarmed, the American prosecution arranged for Tojo to be coached to revise his testimony. Former General Rai, Kichi Tanaka, reportedly acted as an intermediary, ensuring Tojo realigned his statements with the preferred line of defense, the emperor as sacred and blameless. After more than 2 years of legal deliberations, the verdict came in November 1948. Tojo was found guilty on 7 counts, including waging wars of aggression and ordering atrocities against prisoners of war. The sentence was death by hanging. Tojo received the sentence with calm resignation. He did not protest, did not seek clemency. In the weeks that followed, he composed farewell letters to his family, met with his spiritual advisors, and reportedly expressed concern not for himself, but for the Japanese people. He continued to maintain that Japan's war had been one of self-defense, though he acknowledged the scale of suffering it had caused. In his final statement, Tojo apologized for the agony Japan had inflicted and expressed hope that the American military would treat the Japanese people with compassion, given their suffering from firebombings and the atomic bombings. On December 23, 1948, just a week shy of his 64th birthday, Hideki Tojo was executed at Sugamo Prison, alongside 6 other Class A war criminals. The executions were carried out just after midnight. In an effort to prevent his burial site from becoming a shrine or rallying point for militarists, Tojo's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, about 30 miles east of Yokohama, by U.S. Army aircraft. The final act of erasure ensured there would be no grave to visit, no monument to venerate only the memory of a man whose name had come to signify the darkest chapter of Japan's modern history. But even in death, Tojo's legacy would prove complicated and contentious, shaping debates in Japan and abroad about memory, guilt, nationalism, and the meaning of justice. Part 14. Legacy, Memory, and Controversy. The execution of Hideki Tojo in December 1948 did not mark the end of his story. Rather, it opened a new and contentious chapter fought not on the battlefield or in the courtroom, but in the arenas of historical memory, national identity, and political discourse. In the decades that followed his death, Tojo's legacy would be contested, revised, defended, vilified, and even mythologized, both within Japan and across the globe. Tojo's name became an indelible symbol of Japan's wartime aggression, especially in the countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation: China, Korea, the Philippines, and much of Southeast Asia. In China, in particular, he came to personify the atrocities committed by the Japanese military during the war. In a 1,997 survey of Chinese university students, the person most commonly associated with Japanese people was not a pop culture figure or a political leader, but Tojo Hideki, reflecting the enduring scars left by the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Nanjing Massacre. Yet within Japan, perceptions of Tojo have always been more divided. While many Japanese view him as a tragic figure who led the country into a disastrous war, others, particularly on the political far-right, have sought to rehabilitate his image. Some claim he was merely a scapegoat for decisions made collectively by the military elite and the emperor. Others argue that he was a patriotic servant of his nation who did what he believed necessary to protect Japan from colonial domination. One of the most visible symbols of this ongoing controversy is Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the spirits of Japan's war dead are enshrined, including Tojo and 6 other executed Class A war criminals. Their inclusion in the shrine's Book of Souls in 1978 sparked outrage across Asia, particularly in China and South Korea. The shrine, though ostensibly religious and apolitical, became a lightning rod for historical revisionism. Official visits to Yasukuni by Japanese politicians, particularly Prime Minister Shave, triggered diplomatic crises and fueled accusations that Japan has not fully come to terms with its militarist past. In Aichi Prefecture, supporters of Tojo created a private burial site, now called the Grave of the Seven Martyrs, where his remains, or parts thereof, are said to have been secretly preserved. In 1971, this site was bombed by left-wing radicals from the East Asia Anti-Japan Armed Front, who viewed the grave as a monument to fascism. The act reflected just how volatile Tojo's memory remained, even decades after his execution. Tojo's descendants have also played a role in shaping his posthumous reputation. His granddaughter, Yuko Tojo, emerged in the early 2000s as a conservative political candidate and public defender of her grandfather's legacy. She claimed that Japan had fought a defensive war and argued that Tojo was unjustly tried by a victor's tribunal. Though her political campaigns were unsuccessful, she became a prominent voice in the nationalist discourse that sought to reframe Japan's role in World War II as one of Asian liberation rather than conquest. In Japanese popular culture, Tojo's image has varied from that of a villainous warmonger to a misunderstood patriot. The 1998 film Pride, directed by Shunya Ito, portrayed Tojo sympathetically, suggesting that the Tokyo trials were unjust and politically motivated. In contrast, many Western films and historical documentaries have continued to depict him as the arch-militarist, reinforcing the image forged by Allied propaganda during the war. Academic historians remain divided as well. Some, like Herbert P. Bix and John W. Dower, have focused on the ways in which Tojo was used to shield Emperor Hirohito from prosecution. According to their research, American authorities, led by General MacArthur, made a calculated decision to absolve the imperial family of responsibility in order to stabilize post-war Japan. In this view, Tojo became the fall guy, a willing participant in the exoneration of his emperor, whom he never stopped serving even at the cost of his life and reputation. But even these historians do not deny Tojo's central role in launching and sustaining Japan's wars of aggression. As army minister, prime minister, and later army chief of staff, he wielded immense influence and oversaw policies that led to the mass suffering of soldiers, prisoners, and civilians alike. His complicity in forced labor, comfort women, and POW atrocities is well documented and irrefutable. Tojo's greatest tragedy may lie not only in the millions who perished under his regime, but in his sincere belief that he was acting for the good of his country. He was, in his own mind, a loyal servant of the emperor, a man forged by the harsh discipline of the Imperial Army and the unbending tenets of Bushido. He had no room for doubt, for regret, or for moral ambiguity. In the final analysis, Hideki Tojo's life is a mirror held up to the darker impulses of 20th-century nationalism, a portrait of a man who mistook duty for wisdom, aggression for strength, and silence for honor. He was no genius, no monster, no madman, but a product of his time, a bureaucrat of war whose rigid ideology and blind obedience helped bring devastation to half the world. And so he remains, a haunting figure in modern history, neither fully redeemed nor entirely reviled, but forever tied to the catastrophic war he helped to shape and to the enduring question of how nations remember the worst among them.